The one-child policy has existed for a long time and has had many positive and negative effects on the people of China. Although a relaxation of the policy has recently been announced, it still has a great impact. But what is the one-child policy? It was instituted in 1979 by Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping after the death of Mao Zedong in 1976. It was created for many reasons, all leading to one sole reason: population limitation. It regulates the allowed size of families and guidelines for late marriages and childbearing. The regulations reside under a 5-year time frame before a second child is allowed. There are rewards for conforming with the policy and consequences for not. Those that conform with the policy are rewarded with long maternity leave periods and great economic incentives like higher wages, child education prioritization, better housing and healthcare, etc. People that have more than one child without government permission have all of these things taken away from them, and then they face consequences, including heavy fines, confiscation of personal belongings, and denial of schooling for children of that family. The policy also has many exceptions that allow second children, including if the first child is born with chronic illness or disease, a physical or mental illness or disability, etc. A well-known exception is if one of the parents was an only child growing up, which used to require both parents to have been only children growing up until its update in November of 2013. You may be wondering, why was the one-child policy created? The National Population and Family Planning Commission instituted it, and the Chinese government governed it as they thought that embarking on an economic reform process to improve Chinese living standards was necessary. The reason being the population growth of China by about 87.981 million people between 1950 and 1960, peaking in 1953. Children born during the booming were to enter their reproductive years soon, which implied many problems for China. Why did the population boom, though? When Mao Zedong was still alive and still leader of China, he created a campaign called the Great Leap Forward, which attempted to drive China forward economically, socially, governmentally, etc. One of the goals of the Great Leap Forward was encouragement for families to have more children. Mao Zedong thought, as a quote from his campaign for the Great Leap Forward, that the more people there are, the stronger we are. The Great Leap Forward caused birth rates to raise to 4 children a family. During the booming, China was experiencing a bit of social, economical, and environmental problems. The crude death rate rose by about 7.43%, and China experienced about 7.1 million more deaths during the boom than ever before. The Chinese government knew that they had to do something. "We will not be able to develop our economy and raise the living standards of our people," quoted by Deng Xiaoping. The one-child policy was focused around stabilizing China's population at 1.2 billion people by 2000, as it had already hit 1 billion people by 1982. The Chinese government predicted, however, that the population would be 1.4 billion by 2000. They were wrong. The population was successfully stabilized at about 1,242,612,226 people by 2000, successfully preventing about 250 million births. This Chinese propaganda poster was created and placed throughout China to promote the conforming of the one-child policy, which was already great as it was. The one-child policy was a success for the Chinese government, but how did it affect the people of China? Before it was instituted in 1979, Chinese families averaged at about 4 children a family. Then, Chinese citizens' views were changed forever. Children had no idea what it really felt like to have a brother or a sister, as they would refer to their siblings as cousins or other children in their families. However, some children knew what siblings actually were, and growing up longed to have a brother or a sister, as shown in this interview with Xi Yan, a Chinese woman that had to grow up with the one-child policy.
你有没有就说有没有想要弟弟妹妹啊？
想要肯定想，就是小的时候想找人玩嘛，大了之后想找人照顾嘛。
小的小的哦好，然后呢，那就说你小的，比如说你就是你有没有觉得，如果你真的有个弟弟妹妹的话，你要跟他们一起分就很多东西啊，家里的钱呀、就是因为家里把什么东西精力啊，还有就是不管物质上也好，精神上也好，都是在你一个人身上关注的，对不对？如果你要有个弟弟妹妹会不一样，你有没有想过？
我没有想过物质上有什么区别
没有这样想过。
但是我一直觉得有个兄弟姐妹的话会就是精神压力会有点大，因为你毕竟就是我爸再怎么放我出来了，这个他毕竟还是你会有压力，觉得就是你是家里唯一一个小孩子，你毕竟还是跟他们有这个联系的，就是而且这个精神压力不是有个人跟你分担的，就是你就全部都是在你身上。
Before the slight recent relaxation of the policy, families abiding by the policy were given discretionary income for their child's education and consumption. Because of this, educational costs in China substantially grew, and that generation of children was smarter than the last generation. One of the most infamous effects of the one-child policy was Little Emperor Syndrome, a belief that only children would grow up to be self-centered. However, due to a study on only children in Beijing done by a group of Australian researchers, children developed traits that were opposite of what is suggested as the Little Emperor Syndrome, developing many positive and negative traits. Positively, they are more trustworthy, less competitive, and more brave with a higher willingness to take risks. Negatively, they're more pessimistic and less conscientious. Some other effects of the policy include less intimacy between couples and increased migration of Chinese citizens to other foreign countries. The most influential effect of the one-child policy on Chinese citizens is known as the 1-2-4 problem. It is the failure of an only child, 1, to look after his or her parents, 2, as well as all of his or her grandparents, 4. Fertility rates in China declined between 1960 and 1980, which is one of the main causes of the 1-2-4 problem. Fertility rates had fallen from 6 children per woman down to 2. There is also an imbalance of gender in China due to the one-child policy. As reported by Leslie Stahl in 2006,
Leslie, what are some of the consequences of this skewed ratio of boys to girls in China?
When you have that many more men than women, there aren't enough women for the men to marry. And when you have a huge population of single men, sociologists say that you have all kinds of problems with crime, restlessness, and China is already beginning to see that.
the one-child policy solved the many problems that the Chinese government was facing, although many citizens complained that it had ruined their tradition of keeping siblings around the house to take care of their elders. In addition to social effects, researchers suggest that by 2030 there will be about 167 million Chinese people over the age of 65. That is about half of the US population, which is currently 316,100,100 people. Does the one-child policy violate the UN Declaration of Human Rights? It does. Some argue that if the population wasn't contained after the boom of 1950 to 1960, China would have problems due to lack of resources, leading to violation of some of the most important human rights. For example, Article 23, Section 1 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has the right to work in an environment or under employment of their choosing in just and favorable conditions, something that many argue would be impossible due to lack of job openings due to a scarceness of resources. Article 25, Section 1 states that every individual has the right to adequate living standards, including sufficient food, clothing, housing, medical care, social services, all that stuff, as well as the right to security in the event of unemployment, diagnosis of sickness or disability, widowhood, problems from old age, etc. Also argued to be violated for the same reason. The one-child policy violates the UN Declaration of Human Rights because although some argue that Chinese citizens would have lost a lot of rights if the policy weren't enforced, Chinese citizens are already losing more rights than people realize. Some argue that parents of illegal children lose the most rights in general, although they aren't faced with much more punishment than confiscation of belongings, heavy fines of about $30K to $70K, and denial of education. However, almost no one thinks about the illegal children born to families without government permission, known as ghost children, who are entitled to almost no rights at all, being considered invisible and worthless to the government. Ghost children aren't entitled to the same rights that legal children are, violating Article 1 of the Human Rights Declaration, which states that all humans are born free and equal in terms of dignity and rights. For the same reason, the following articles are therefore nullified for ghost children. Article 2, which states that everyone is entitled to all freedoms and rights contained in the Declaration without distinction of birth, as well as many other aspects. Article 7, which states that everyone is entitled to the rights and freedoms in the Declaration without discrimination, as well as many other different articles within the Declaration of Human Rights. The one-child policy is a violation of the UN Declaration of Human Rights because ghost children are not entitled to an identity, to freedom, or to any of the rights set forth within the UN Declaration of Human Rights. I hope you may have enjoyed this presentation of sorts. Now, I'm gonna have a little bit of a performance, per se.